We shall now hear from our panelists. We have a tight schedule today, so I shall be monitoring our time very closely. And after all the panelists have spoken, we shall have time for questions and comments from our panelists and the audience. Our first speaker is Phil Zimbardo, PhD, Stanford Emeritus Professor, who taught on this campus for 40 years. He has served as expert witness for one of the MP guards at Abu Ghraib and has studied U.S. police interrogation processes and torture, interrogation by state-sanctioned civil police in Brazil during their military junta period. He is the author of The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil. Dr. Zimbardo has shown much courage and integrity in calling for judicial investigations, not only of the torture memos of 2002, but also those responsible for Abu Ghraib torture. Please welcome Phil Zimbardo.
I'm delighted to be back at the law school. I guess I talked here 2 years ago. I can't hear. Take one of these. I'm delighted to be back at the law school. I have 15 minutes, which cover a lot of ground. So my presentation is really psychological reflections on torture. I want to start with U.S. police detective interrogations, which used to involve third degree, which is one kind of torture, essentially beating the suspect up until he or she talked. Before the Supreme Court ruling that outlawed third degree, on average, when detectives in police departments in the United States interrogate anyone, 80% of the time they got confessions. Of course, the police strongly opposed that liberal ruling. They said, you're going to put us out of business. Nobody is going to talk. The interesting thing is, after the ruling, still 80% of everybody interrogated in detective centers around the country gave confessions. The question is, how come? Abe Goldstein, who was a professor of law at Yale, when I was a graduate student, then became the dean of law school, hired me to do research for him on how come. How is it possible that the police are getting that high level of confessions without third degree? So what I did is I talked to police detectives. I read all their manuals. The leading one was called Inbow and Reed. I think either Inbow or Reed is still the book that all detectives use in training. The simple key is they all say you must take time to establish rapport. You must take time to know the person you're interrogating. In some cases, if it's a kid, you want to be his uncle, his dad, his confidant. And then you exploit psychological vulnerability. So the switch was from physical to psychological, and they go through in great detail. And so I became an expert. And in fact, in many cases, they get false confessions of murder. And at the end, the person said, he was like my uncle. I would do anything he asked, including signing a statement about I killed somebody when I actually didn't. Torture was clearly counterproductive, unnecessary in that context. So what kinds of torture work? State-sanctioned torture that's used really to spread terror. It's not to get information. It's used to spread terror in a given population through induced trauma of victims. You want victims to go back and say, these people are crazy, they'll do anything. Certainly it's one of the issues now in the East Congo, where rape is used as a torture terror tactic. The second place it works, as we see the TV story 24, is when you are sure that this victim, this suspect, knows where the fruits of the crime is, knows where he has planted the ticking bomb. It turns out that's almost never the case. So that's a scenario that the public is presented with. Suppose somebody put a nuclear bomb under the Empire State, somewhere in New York, and you got 24 hours to find it. That almost is never the case. It never is part of a fishing expedition. We have a large population of inmates, of prisoners, of detainees, whatever you want to call them, enemy combatants, where only a very small percentage has possible relevant information. And that is the case in Guantanamo Bay and throughout Abu Ghraib. If you don't know about it, you should be aware that throughout Latin America and Central America in the 50s and 60s, I guess up to 79, the fascist dictators who took over with complicity of the CIA in the United States practiced routine torture. We interviewed 31 tortures and death squad murders in Brazil, published a book, University of California Press. It's going to be here for you on closed reserve. And essentially, what we discovered was these people who did horrendous things were ordinary. We could not find anything in their background, no sadistic tendencies, nothing of that kind. But they were trained in how to be effective torturers. The other book that's available is an earlier book by a colleague of mine who studied torturers in Greece. In Greece, it was a military unit, an elite military unit, again, that trained soldiers how to be torturers. In Brazil and other places, it was the civil police. So here's the image of the modern iconic image of torture. And the guy who thought that up, essentially, this guy standing on a box, you put a hood over his head, put electrodes on, and you say, when your body gives out and you fall off, you'll be electrocuted. Of course, they thought it was funny because, as you see, the electrodes weren't going anywhere. This guy's named Chip Frederick. He's the guy who defended for the abuses at Abu Ghraib. Here's a picture of him just before that. Everything I can find out about this guy, he is as normal, healthy, a good guy as possible from the time he was a kid to the time he did this event. And after he left that situation again, he's a loving father, husband, and so forth. So he's one of the so-called bad apples that I argue was a good apple put in a bad barrel. So I want to very quickly show you something that you probably have not seen, because these are publicly prohibited images, from the cameras of the soldiers on the night shift in Tijuana and Abu Ghraib. So this is digitally documented depravity. They started taking pictures of everything because there was no censorship. Everybody had a digital camera. And they were proud of what they were doing. What nobody told us is these are not real soldiers, the Army reservists, who have no status in the military. So these are their bragging rights. They put these on screensavers. They showed it to colleagues in the military, and everybody knew this was going on, and it went on for 3 solid months. So let's go down. I added sound and motion in order to increase the impact. But again, these were prohibited. What we saw the expose in 2004 were just a small number of them. So here's a case example of torture, which is really degradation and humiliation. So let's go down that dungeon.